The morning Sandra Holt pulled her Jeep Cherokee into the parking space I had sealed with a decorative concrete apron extension 48 hours earlier, and watched her front tires contact the raised edge of the new concrete and stop. I was in a window seat somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico, watching the same moment on my phone through the camera I had mounted in my porch light fixture 6 days before boarding my flight to Costa Rica. And what I felt looking at that footage from 35,000 feet was not triumph or vindication, but the specific clean satisfaction of an engineer who has designed a system correctly and is watching it perform within its specified parameters on the first real operational test. My name is Priya Ashford. I am 44 years old, a licensed structural engineer specializing in concrete systems and foundation design with 19 years of professional experience, and I have lived in the Cedarwood Park HOA development in Central Florida for 5 years. My husband, Rohan, is a software architect. Our house is a 3-bedroom contemporary on a corner lot with an attached garage and a paved parking apron in front of the garage that was designed and permitted as part of the original construction, and that provided 2 parking positions in addition to the single-car garage, which was significant because Rohan and I each drove separately to different workplaces, and the 2 apron positions plus the garage allowed us to park all 3 of our vehicles on our own property without using the street. Sandra Holt had lived directly across Pinecrest Drive from us for 3 years. She was 56, the owner of a small landscaping business that she operated from a truck she kept at her property, along with a Jeep Cherokee that she used as her personal vehicle. Her lot had a standard residential driveway with space for 2 vehicles, which accommodated her truck and the Cherokee without difficulty when both were present. When the truck was out on jobs, which was most weekdays, she had 1 vehicle on her driveway and a second available position. When the truck was home, she had 2 vehicles and 2 positions and no excess. The problem from Sandra's perspective was that her driveway required a backing maneuver to exit onto Pinecrest Drive that she found inconvenient. Her driveway angle relative to the street made the backing maneuver slightly awkward at the street edge, not dangerous, not technically difficult, just mildly inconvenient in the way that driveway geometry is sometimes mildly inconvenient when the lot was designed for efficiency rather than ease of exit. My parking apron, which was directly across the street from her driveway, provided a convenient solution to Sandra's inconvenience problem. She could pull forward into my apron, execute a simple forward turn, and exit onto Pinecrest Drive facing forward rather than backing. The maneuver took approximately 40 seconds and used approximately 12 feet of my parking apron surface for 20 of those seconds. She had been doing this since my 3rd month in the house. I had established this through camera footage the same way every person in this collection established the same thing: camera, pattern recognition, documentation. I had spoken to Sandra about it in month 4. She was pleasant about it in the way that people are pleasant when they expect pleasantness to resolve a conversation without requiring behavioral change. She said she had not realized I minded and would find another way. She did not find another way. The camera showed her in my apron on day 6 after our conversation. I had done the sequence: 6 conversations over 22 months, 3 written notes, 2 HOA complaints, 1 fine paid without apparent behavioral impact, 1 attorney letter from my property lawyer Daniel Cross that Sandra had described to Rohan when he answered her return call as more than the situation warranted. By month 22, I had 61 documented incidents after the camera installation and an understanding of Sandra's pattern that was as thorough as any traffic study I had conducted professionally. She used my apron on weekday mornings between 7:15 and 7:45 when she was leaving for job sites. She used it on weekday afternoons between 4:30 and 5:15 on return. She used it on Saturday mornings occasionally. She had never used it on Sundays, which I had noted as a data point without drawing conclusions. The structural solution had been in my mind since month 15. I had been patient about the behavioral sequence in the same way every structural engineer in this collection was patient, because the behavioral sequence builds the record that makes the structural solution legally defensible and morally clean. By month 22, the record was complete, and the structural solution was designed, and permitted and waiting for the right timing. The right timing was our Costa Rica trip. Rohan and I had been planning the trip since the previous October. We had a specific itinerary: San Jose for 2 days, the Arenal region for 4, the Nicoya Peninsula for 5, and a final 2 days in San Jose before flying home. 13 days total. We had wanted to go for 3 years and had deferred twice, once for a work conflict and once for a family obligation, and I had told Rohan in January that this was the year and that I intended to install the apron extension before we left so the concrete would be fully cured and operational before we returned. The apron extension was a 2-inch concrete overlay across the front edge of my parking apron, covering the full width of the apron with a 1.5-inch raised lip at the street side edge. The lip height was specific and calculated. It was sufficient to register as a physical impediment to a vehicle approaching from the street at low speed and cause the driver to stop, which was its function. It was not sufficient to damage a vehicle's tires or suspension if contacted at the low speeds involved in a parking maneuver. The design was safe, which was a requirement I had imposed on myself because I was not interested in causing harm to Sandra's vehicle. I was interested in causing her to stop using my apron. The overlay design also included a decorative element that I had added because I was an engineer and because I did not install features on my own property that I was not proud of. I had used a broom-finished surface texture on the overlay that matched the existing apron texture and had scored a simple geometric pattern in the wet concrete before it set, a pattern consistent with decorative concrete work common in Florida residential properties. The overlay looked like a deliberate design choice for the apron edge treatment. It looked, as Rohan said when he saw the finished work, like something an architect would do to dress up a driveway. I had pulled the permit for the overlay 2 weeks before installation. Florida residential permits for concrete additions to existing permitted driveways were processed through the county building department, and mine was issued in 9 days. I had notified the HOA through Daniel that a permitted driveway modification was being installed, providing the permit number and the general description of the work. The HOA coordinator, a woman named Dana Pratt, who I had dealt with professionally for 5 years, had acknowledged the notification without issue. I had poured the overlay on a Saturday working alone because the work was straightforward and because I had been pouring concrete for 19 years and did not need assistance for a 2-inch overlay across a 12-foot apron width. The mixed design was 3000 psi with polypropylene fiber reinforcement for crack resistance and a bonding agent at the interface with the existing concrete. I had prepared the existing surface with mechanical scarification to improve bond strength, which was the correct preparation and which I would have required on any project where I was adding a concrete overlay to existing concrete. The overlay cured for 6 days before I activated it by driving my car out of the apron and noting that the exit angle over the lip was clean and smooth for my vehicle, which it was because I had designed the lip geometry for my own exit angle. Then I installed the 4 cameras, confirmed cloud storage was functioning, packed for Costa Rica, and drove to the airport. The first alert came on day 3 of the trip, which was our first full day in the Arenal region, 7:22 in the morning Florida time, which was 6:22 in Costa Rica. I was awake because the howler monkeys near our lodge had opinions about dawn that they expressed enthusiastically and at volume, and I had my phone open and was watching the light come up over the volcano when the alert arrived. Sandra's Jeep Cherokee pulled up to my apron at its normal approach angle and began the forward turn she had been executing in my apron for 22 months. The front tires contacted the raised lip at approximately 7 miles per hour, which was the typical entry speed the camera had recorded in prior incidents. The lip was 1.5 inches high. At 7 miles per hour, the tire contact was firm enough to communicate a distinct physical impediment and cause the driver to stop and assess. Sandra stopped. The camera showed the Jeep sitting at the lip edge for 40 seconds. Then she pulled back onto Pinecrest Drive and drove east toward her driveway. I noted the timestamp and outcome. I put the phone on the nightstand. I listened to the howler monkeys for another 10 minutes, then I got up and went to see the volcano. The alerts over the following 12 days showed a pattern I recognized from every other structural solution in this collection. Day 3, first contact, 40-second pause, departure. Day 4, contact from a slightly different approach angle, same result. Day 5, no contact. Day 6, contact, longer pause, departure. Day 7 through 9, no contact. Day 10, contact from the most aggressive approach angle the Jeep's geometry permitted, meaning the tightest turn that would bring her front tires perpendicular to the lip, rather than at an angle, contact at the lip, departure. On day 11, I received an alert that showed Sandra getting out of the Jeep and examining the overlay from the sidewalk. She walked the full width of the lip, ran her hand along the raised edge, stood up, and looked at the decorative scoring pattern on the overlay surface. She looked at the house for a moment. She looked at the porch light fixture where the primary camera was mounted. She looked at the camera for 4 seconds. Then she got back in the Jeep and drove to her driveway and executed the backing maneuver she had been finding inconvenient for 3 years. I sent the footage to Daniel from the Nicoya Peninsula, where Rohan and I were sitting on a beach watching pelicans work the surf line. Daniel acknowledged receipt and noted that the inspection footage confirmed Sandra's awareness of the modified apron surface, which was relevant to the civil claims documentation of her understanding that the space was no longer accessible for unauthorized use. The civil claim covered 61 incidents, the paid fine, the attorney letter, the overlay installation costs, the camera system costs, Daniel's fees, and compensatory damages for 22 months of documented unauthorized apron use. It was filed the week before our departure and had been waiting for whatever happened after the installation. Sandra retained a local attorney named Marcus Aldrich, who called Daniel during the first week of our trip. Marcus had reviewed the claim and the documentation, and his initial position was that the overlay modification had been installed as a deliberate interference with his client's established access pattern. Daniel sent him the permit number, the county building department approval record, the HOA notification acknowledgement, my professional engineering specifications for the overlay, and the concrete mix design documentation. He noted that the overlay was a permitted improvement to my private property, that his client had no established access rights to my private property, and that the documentation of 61 unauthorized incidents over 22 months following multiple formal requests to stop established that the overlay was a proportionate and legally appropriate response to a sustained pattern of unauthorized use. Marcus called Daniel after reviewing the materials. Daniel told me afterward that the call had been brief and that Marcus's tone had the specific quality of an attorney who had reviewed complete documentation and understood the exposure his client was facing. Marcus said his client wanted to resolve the matter. Daniel said the demand was $13,400, covering all documented costs and compensatory damages. Marcus said she used a parking apron for a turnaround maneuver. The damages seemed significant for that conduct. Daniel said she used it 61 times after being asked to stop 6 times, after receiving 3 written notes, after 2 HOA complaints, after paying a fine, and after receiving a formal attorney letter. The damages are proportionate to 22 months of sustained, unauthorized use that continued despite every available behavioral intervention. Marcus said, "I will discuss it with my client." He called back the following day. Sandra would pay $12,800. Daniel called me in Costa Rica. Rohan and I were at a restaurant in Tamarindo eating ceviche and watching the Pacific do what the Pacific does at sunset along the Nicoya coast, which is to say it was turning colors that seemed excessive until you understood that the Pacific had been doing this every evening for longer than anyone could calculate and had gotten very good at it. Daniel said, $12,800, she is paying. I said, accepted. He said, the overlay worked. I said, the overlay performed within its specified parameters. He said, you said that about a concrete lip on a parking apron. I said every system has specified parameters. The lip height was calculated for a specific vehicle approach speed and tire contact geometry. It performed as calculated. He said, I have been practicing property law for 17 years, and I have never had a client who specified the parameters for a parking apron lip height. I said the parameters are what make it work correctly. If the lip is too low, it does not register as an impediment. If it is too high, it damages vehicles. The correct height is calculated from the vehicle approach speed and the contact force at that speed. He said, what is the correct height? I said 1.5 inches at approach speeds up to 10 miles per hour. At 10 miles per hour, the contact force is sufficient to cause a stop without tire or suspension impact. He said, you calculated the approach speed. I said I had 22 months of camera footage showing her approach speed at that apron edge. Average 7.2 miles per hour, maximum 9.1. He said, you designed the lip for her approach speed. I said I designed the lip for the operational parameters of the installation. Her approach speed was within those parameters. He said, Priya, I am going to tell you something. I said, tell me. He said, in 17 years, I have had clients who installed gates, bollards, brick pillars, and hydraulic barriers to address parking problems. You are the first one who calculated the approach speed and designed the lip height accordingly. That is either impressive or alarming. I said, it is engineering. He said, yes, that is what I said. We flew home on a Thursday. The house was as I had left it. The apron was as I had installed it. The overlay was cured and solid, and the decorative scoring pattern was clean. The raised lip at the street edge was 1.5 inches high, smooth at the top, correctly angled at the base for drainage, finished in the broom texture that matched the existing apron. Rohan stood in the driveway looking at the overlay for a moment after we carried the bags in. He said, it looks like it was always there. I said, the texture matches. The scoring is consistent with the existing pattern. He said, I know, I mean it looks intentional. I said, it is intentional. He said, I mean it looks like something we always planned to do to the apron edge. I said, it is something I planned for approximately 7 months. He said, you planned a decorative concrete apron edge treatment for 7 months. I said, I planned the structural solution. The decorative element was part of making the structural solution look correct rather than reactive. He said, correct meaning it looks like it belongs. I said, correct meaning it meets the standard I hold for any concrete work I install on my own property. He went inside. I stood in the driveway for a moment and looked at the apron and the overlay and the lip and the cameras mounted in the porch light and the eave above the garage and the quiet of Pinecrest Drive at 10 in the morning on a Thursday with no alerts on my phone and nothing on the camera feeds except the empty street and the ordinary day. The system had performed correctly. The documentation was complete. The settlement was paid. The overlay was there and would be there for 30 years if I maintained it correctly. I would maintain it correctly. I always maintained my work correctly. That was the standard. That was always the standard. And the standard was sufficient. It was always sufficient when you applied it correctly from the beginning and did not deviate from it at any point along the way. Thumbnail text, she used his apron 61 times. A structural engineer calculated the exact lip height for her approach speed. She never got in again.